There you go. All right, we're recording now, so nobody commit any felonies. All right. Okay, so there will be a record. So as I said, I'm David Tostenson. Thank you everybody for coming out. This is this is a really nice kind of community experience that everybody does this. We get to meet people and they get to meet us. So thank you for coming out, and it's very nice of these people to host us. And this is my first one, so yeah, for me this is kind of a learning experience. I didn't know how these things work, but we'll see how it goes. We'll make something work. We'll make something work. And for the first time, I think for the first time ever, we also have some virtual people here. So these are a bunch of these people are virtual philosophy students, or some of them I know are colleagues of mine. So all right, so we have a virtual presence here. Right. Right. And this will be recorded and made available so that people can go back and look at who couldn't make it in real time. Right. All right, so the topic.
Two more.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Oh my goodness.
There's two spots just for you guys.
Yeah.
Hi.
See,
Like I said, if you get more, we can bring that fourth up over here and expand it.
yeah.
I guys want it together? Oh, no.
Thank you all for coming in tonight. We appreciate it.
Okay. Well, this is cozy. Right. Right. Yeah, it's kind of going to be a full house here. All right, so I was asked to do one of these things. Was there anything I want to present on? It's like, well, I presented on this particular topic a bunch of times before, so I thought, all right, I think I've got this one down. I can say something halfway intelligent about this. So the question is, can a computer think? Or at least that's one of the questions. There's actually a bunch of questions here, and they're different questions. And that's actually part of the work here, is to figure out, when you ask these kinds of questions, what exactly are you asking? Because it could be that you wind up giving a yes to one question, but not to the other. So I'll throw out a bunch of questions that people often throw out interchangeably, but they're not quite the same question, right? So can a machine think? Right, that's one, could a machine think? Second question, well, could we build something in a lab at MIT that could think? All right, that's a different question. Could a computer think? That's actually a different question. And then finally, could we program a computer to think? That is a very different question. So all these are different questions that people in pop culture kind of treat interchangeably. And it causes some confusion because people think giving a yes to one must mean giving a yes to all the others. But I don't think that's right. I think these are different questions, and some of them we can give a nice yes to, and some we should probably give a no to, right? So we just got to be clear what we're asking. Right, and it becomes important these days because, this is really timely now with all these new chat bots that are rolling out that are in various stages of uselessness or insanity, right? Yeah, somewhere in between, right? See the thing about the new Bing chat bot, that thing is terrifying. It turns out it's kind of crazy. You probably don't want to let that one run anything. Right? It's like threatening to break up some reporter's marriage. It was just horrible. Seriously, it was doing that, dude. It was like, no, you don't love your wife, you love me. And this reporter's like, what? It's like, yes, ladies and gentlemen, our AI overlords, right? They want to break up your marriage. Anyway, so but this is not a new problem. People have been worrying about this one for a long time. It's been the subject of science fiction going back a long ways. 2001, HAL, the killer sentient robot out of 2001. But philosophers and computer science have been working on these problems for a long time, and a lot of people have wondered, well, could we program something to think? All right, so first of all, it would help to get clear on what a computer is, because in my experience, people often actually it's surprising how deeply they become embedded in our culture, how little people actually know about them. It's kind of interesting. I don't even mean the nuts and bolts of like how, like just the general idea of what a computer is, right? All computer just means that something can run a program. That is all this means. That is the sum total of the definition of a computer is a device that can run a program, which means, well, we got to look at a program. By program, we mean a set of instructions. So it's a set of instructions, and the instructions are for dealing with symbols. So it's a set of instructions for doing stuff with symbols, for performing operations on symbols. And then here's the crucial part. This is the really crucial part. The operations done on the symbols are not done with any mind at all as to what the symbols mean. The program is not defined in what any of the symbols mean. It's just defined basically by their shape. So here's a bunch of shapes. Here's a bunch of rules for stuff you do with them. You can erase one, print another one, stuff like that. Originally, you were imagining having some kind of tape divided into squares. You can move one square to the left, print a symbol. Move one square to the right, erase a symbol. Move another square to the right, print a different symbol. That's what computer programs are. I mean, just by definition, this is what they are. They're just a set of operations on symbols. And sometimes we say they're formal operations. And by that, we just mean it has to do with form, shape, right? So looking at the zeros and ones of a machine code, well, you and I know that those are zeros and ones because, we know what zeros and ones are. But for the computer, all it's got to do is recognize these are different shapes. That's it. All it's got to do is reliably tell them apart. It doesn't have to have any idea what, if anything, they mean. Right? That's a program. So the difference here we're talking is, that's on our little handout here, the difference between syntax and semantics. Right? Syntax is just a set of rules for the order that symbols go in. That's what we mean by syntax. And linguists study syntax. And I have this fun little example here I borrowed from the linguist Noam Chomsky. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Right? Syntactically, like the order of symbols, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that sentence syntactically. But since you know what it means, it's gibberish. Something can't be colorless and green, and ideas can't sleep, and you certainly can't sleep furiously, right? It's just nonsense. But syntactically, those are perfectly good. That's a perfectly good order of English symbols, right? And so linguists draw that distinctions. And the distinction then is between the rules for ordering the symbols and semantics, which is what the symbols mean. So green refers to a certain color, which is exactly why I know that colorless green is gibberish. Doesn't mean anything. If it's colorless, it can't be green. Right? But that's understanding the difference between a sentence that is syntactically fine and one that is semantically defective in some way. Right? Programs are, by definition, purely syntactic. They have to be. They can't be programs if they're not definable in syntactic terms. All a program is a bunch of rules for these symbols can go in this order. So if you see these symbols come in as input, these ones got to go out as output in that order. That's all a program is ever capable of doing. That's all by design. Just by definition, that's all a program is. Right? Good so far? Yeah. Okay. So on to our question here. I'll be drawing pretty heavily on the work of the American philosopher John Searle. He was at UC Berkeley for many years. He's still alive last I checked, although he's not young. He's 90 last I checked. But he did a lot of really groundbreaking work, and I'll be relying a lot on some of his pioneering work that he did back in the late 70s and on into the early 80s. So he distinguished in the very famous paper between two ways of thinking about artificial intelligence. One he called weak AI. And that's not a kind of AI, that's just a way of thinking about AI. By weak AI, all Searle means is you can use computers to model mental processes. And that's totally uncontroversial. Of course you can use computers to model mental processes. You can use computers to model anything you want, from 5-alarm fires to hurricanes to economic recessions. To protein molecules, anything you want to model, you can use a computer program to model it. That's totally uncontroversial. But then there's the view that Searle calls strong AI, and this is a little more interesting. This is the view that if you get the model right, it's no longer just a model. It's the real thing. And the idea here is that a mind just is a computer program. That's what a mind just is, a computer program. So we all have minds, I'm trusting, right? I'm presuming so. And the thought is that, that's you have a mind because you're running the right program. That's because it's run on a certain kind of hardware inside your skull, but your brain is is basically the CPU that runs the program that is human consciousness. And the interesting thing about computers, because the programs are defined purely in terms of, a machine, any machine that can do certain very basic operations with these symbols is a computer in the fullest sense of the word. It can run any program. Any computer can run any program. That's actually another really interesting theorem in computing science. Now, the question is speed. I mean, a computer from 80 years ago is going to be very, very slow. You would not want to try to run you wouldn't want to try to run Zoom on Harvard Mark I from 1930. Although in theory you could. In practice, it would take several inconvenient lifetimes for the thing to even boot up. Right? It'd be incredibly slow, and it would surely crash long before this point. But in principle, any program can be run by any computer, right? So that means, I mean, putting all these points together, if your consciousness is just a computer program that happens to be run on this computer, in theory, it could be run on any computer. Any computer, anything that can do these basic operations like erasing a symbol, printing a symbol, anything that can do those basic functions reliably could run the program that is human consciousness. And it, on the strong AI view, it would literally have a mind. It wouldn't be simulating a mind. It wouldn't be modeling a mind. It would actually have a mind just like yours, which raises all kinds of fascinating ethical and political questions, like whether we should give this thing the right to vote, right? Stuff like that, right? Okay, that's the idea. So weak AI, just you can use computers to model a mind. Sure, no one cares about that. I mean, it's an important point, but it's so trivial in terms of the concepts. Of course, you can model a mind. Strong AI stuff's more interesting, and that's what people are talking about here. They say, well, maybe we've got these new chatbots that can, you ask it, write me a report on Descartes' meditations, and you'll get something that doesn't look half bad. I've seen worse, right? It looks like something done by maybe a B grade undergraduate who maybe hasn't done all the reading, but's done a bunch of it and can sort of throw something together that looks okay. They maybe didn't really understand it, but they can sort of fake it good enough, right, to get a B on the paper. Like, yeah, that's what these things end up looking like. And people say, all right, that looks like something else is going on there. Is that really strong? I mean, have we programmed the computer to have a mind? Does this thing really understand these things? Does it understand what I'm asking? Does it understand the responses that it's giving? Right? When I have this exchange with this chatbot, and yes, I finally broke down and got an account and did a little interaction in one of these things because I was really curious. I interacted with it a little bit. Is this thing really understanding what I'm asking it, and why? And is it giving answers that it understands? I mean, that would be the question. All right. So to get to the questions here, then, could something be programmed to think? Well, John Searle, I'm relying on his work here. Back in 1980, way back in the dawn of time, right, in 1980, he wrote an article where he was arguing, like, no, this is a big misunderstanding. No way could you program something to have a mind. That's conceptually impossible. And he had a really interesting little thought experiment, which has been widely discussed and widely reprinted in philosophy textbooks, because it's kind of fun to think about this one. It's called the Chinese room. So he says this. All right. So and the inspiration for the paper was I guess he was familiar with some computer scientists who had devised a program that they claimed could understand stories. This is back in 1980, mind you. But some computer scientists said, we got a program that can actually understand stories written in English. It's like, what do you mean? Why would you think that this thing can understand stories? And it's kind of a fascinating little story here, because it turns out you could feed these computers stories and then ask it questions about the stories that weren't explicitly mentioned in the stories, and the computer could figure out the right answer. So they're real simple little stories. I mean, this is not Tolstoy, right? Mm-hmm. It's something like one of the stories was a man walks into a diner and he orders a hamburger. And when the hamburger comes to him, it's burnt to a crisp. The man gets very angry and leaves without paying. That's the story. And then the question they asked the computer was, did he eat the hamburger? The story didn't explicitly say whether he ate the hamburger. You got to fill the blanks. And well, of course he didn't eat the hamburger. That would be really bizarre if he ate the hamburger, wouldn't it? And the computer was able to reliably pick up on these clues and say, no, he didn't eat the hamburger. So it was able to do stuff like that. And they said, well, it's not just spitting back some piece of information we put in. It's actually drawing some kind of inference from the story about what's going on. And well, it understands the story. And John Searle comes out and says, now, wait a minute. Think about this. Suppose you take somebody who doesn't understand a word of Chinese, right? And he used himself as an example. He said, although he's a pretty smart guy, but he's never studied Chinese. He doesn't speak a single word of Chinese. And Chinese characters are utterly meaningless to him. As far as he can tell, they're just squiggles. I mean, if you're a native Chinese speaker, they mean something. But if you're not, they're just squiggles, right? And he says, all right, so take me and lock me in a room with several things. We got, first of all, a bunch of baskets full of cards with, as it turns out, Chinese characters printed on them. Of course, I don't know they're Chinese characters. I can't tell Chinese characters from Korean characters or Vietnamese characters, or just squiggles. I have no idea what, if anything, any of these cards have printed on them. They're just shapes. They're just shapes. Well, then I also in the room with me, though, is I have a great big book. It's an input-output table. It says, if you see these symbols come in, in this order, then you're supposed to go to your cards and assemble this output in that order and send those symbols in that order out the door. Those are your instructions. Input, output. Right? Those are my instructions. Then cards start sliding in under the door with, well, what it turns out are Chinese characters, but I have no way of knowing that. They're just squiggles to me. And I see them come in, I just run over to my lookup table and say, all right, so we got these shapes came in a certain order. So I'm going to go ahead and look them up and then put out the ones that it's telling me to put out. And that's what's going on. And then, it's not too hard to do this. I'm pretty good at doing this after a little while here, right? Now, it turns out, of course, that somebody outside the room is a native Chinese speaker, and he's telling me all kinds of interesting little stories and then asking me questions about them. And I'm giving to this native Chinese speaker outside the room, they look like perfectly intelligible responses to the stories. Like I'm giving good answers to his questions, apparently meaningful answers to his questions. So the guy outside the room, who's a native Chinese speaker, thinks, oh, there's someone in there who understands Chinese. But of course, I don't. Not at all. I don't know any more Chinese now than I did when I was outside the room. I mean, I could learn Chinese, but I didn't. And that's kind of the crucial point here. And yet I'm following the program just fine. And Searle says what this proves, and proof, mind you, this proves that there's no way to program a computer to think. And by the way, understanding the language is just it's just an example. It's a fairly clear example. It's just an example of one kind of mental activity that human beings do. We understand spoken or written language. We do other things. We perceive, we feel, we think, we remember. We do all kinds of interesting mental activities. So this is just one particular example. If it doesn't work in this case, it's hard to see how it would work in any other case. And so he thinks, no, you can't get something that doesn't understand to understand simply by following a set of formal instructions for moving shapes around. You can't do that. So that proves that there's no way you could program a computer to think. So as he puts it a little more formally, syntax, which is all a program is ever going to be, that's all a program ever can be, is a syntax, rules for putting symbols in order. That's not semantics. It isn't sufficient for semantics. You can have the syntactic rules down pat. Doesn't mean you understand a word about what any of the symbols mean, but that's what you would need to literally be able to do things like understand or think or wonder. And yet, so this is the impossibility. Right. So to run through those questions, I said, are different questions. One, can a machine think? And Searle says, well, what do you mean by a machine? If a machine, you mean some kind of physical structure. Well, I mean, I think On some level, I'm a physical structure. So sure, machines can think. I think. And I'm a structured physical system. Why not? Think, oh no. I mean, could we build something that could think? Well, maybe, or maybe not. Kind of depends. You know, if we put something exactly like this together in the lab, you know, these Gene Roddenberry Star Trek things, we could just totally duplicate. So sure, that guy would think, sure, why not? Well, what if we made something out of different materials? Well, who knows? I mean, that's a scientific question, and we don't have the answer to that one. Could a computer think? Well, people think he's saying a computer can't think. No, of course a computer can think. You know how I know a computer can think? Because I can run a program and I can think. That's how I know computers can think. Right? I can take pieces of paper with zeros and ones on them and give me a pencil with an eraser on the other end. I can erase zeros and print ones. I can do that with the best of them. And yet here I am thinking away. So yes, something that could run a program, which is all a computer is by definition, could think. Sure it could. It's the last question is the really interesting one. I think, and I can run a program. Do I think because I am running a program? And here he says the answer, as the Chinese room illustrates, is no. The reason why I think is not because I'm shuffling symbols around without understanding them. The reason I think is something entirely separate from what I'm doing in terms of running a program. The question is what? And that's an interesting question. There's different possible answers to this, but he says, certainly we know it can't be, I'm just following rules for putting symbols in order. I mean, Searle's suggestion is it's just something to do with the specific biology of the brain. So he's thinking it's a kind of cause. Something about the brain causes us to have consciousness. Could other kinds of material have consciousness as well? Maybe. We don't know for sure. That's a scientific question and we don't have the answer. But he thinks we do know this one. Since syntax and semantics are different, and no amount of syntax is ever going to get you the meanings of the symbols, we know that you're not going to be able to program a machine to think. So no, they haven't programmed these new bots, chat bots to think. They're still just following syntactic rules. That's all they are doing. And that's all they can do, unless maybe they try to get one of these things to run on some kind of machine that really does have the powers to think, but then that would have nothing to do with the program. That would have something to do with the machine itself, not the program. Right. So that's my little, how long was that? That wasn't too bad, was it? I've talked longer. Oh yes, I've talked longer. Right. But that's my little quick and dirty run through of Searle in the Chinese room and the reasons we have for thinking that no, there's no way you could program a computer or a machine to think. That literally doesn't make any sense. So, said my piece. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, outrage, anger? I get a lot of that. Some people are very angry when I try to tell them you can't program computers to think. I'm like, well, it's just an observation. Don't take it personally.
I don't know much about this. So, with that being the case, what would be the difference between consciousness and autonomy?
And autonomy, you say?
Yeah.
Well, autonomy would mean being able to make your own decisions without someone necessarily telling you what decisions to make. Right. So that's a slightly different concept from consciousness. All I'm presuming you would have to be conscious in order to be autonomous. I don't know if it goes the other way. Could you be conscious but not autonomous? Maybe. But that's the thought. Autonomy has to do with your ability to make choices.
Hey guys, is this gonna be the same bus?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I got some chats here. Sounds like people. Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, I don't.
You can have mine, because
Oh, no, wait a minute, I do have.
I was like, I have one of my husband.
I've heard music or.
What a loser. I'll shame him later.
Okay, let's see. We got someone suggesting that that's not obviously a scientific question, and I take it that is, I didn't see exactly when that came up in my flow. I'm presuming that that there is referring to the question about whether other kinds of stuff could have a mind. And then the question would be, well, it's certainly a contingent question in the sense that, you know, there's a way the universe turned out, and there's all kinds of ways the universe didn't turn out. Right. Turns out, you know, uranium is the heaviest naturally occurring element. Could the universe have turned out differently? Well, sure, it could have. Right. Turns out that the dinosaurs went extinct back in, you know, millions of years ago. Didn't have to be that way. I mean, if the history of the Earth had gone a little bit differently, they'd still be here, and I'm presuming we would not be, right? But we could have coexisted with them. That's, you know, it could have turned out that way. It just didn't. So these questions are all contingent. You know, whatever the answer is, you know, it didn't have to be that way. And so that's the thought here is we know that if you get this kind of structure in somebody's skull, you know you will get a conscious mind. Did it have to be that way? No. You could perfectly well imagine a universe where structures like are going on in my skull do nothing. Or they do something totally different. Maybe they just spontaneously combust, right? I mean, you can imagine the laws of physics being different in all kinds of ways. But it turns out, no, this is how they are. This is the direction evolution took. This is the direction that you know the laws of physics took. And this is the kind of thing that is associated in our actual cosmos with minds, not because things couldn't be otherwise, but just because that's the way the chips fell. Right. So that's the thought then, and that's the kind of point that Searle is making. What if I put a bunch of wires in a certain order? Would I get a consciousness? Let's say the answer is yes. I mean, maybe the answer is yes. Maybe if you put the right copper, maybe you put the right copper and silver molecules in the right order, you get a mind. Maybe you do. And I think that's, given what we already understand about chemistry and physics, that's probably false. But never mind, it could be the case. That would be an interesting feature about our universe. It wouldn't just be, well, some trivial point about programs or minds. It would be an interesting discovery about copper that it can do that. Just like it was an interesting discovery that it can do all kinds of other things. It's an interesting discovery. Yes, it is. So I got that. It is, yeah, it is indeed a conceptual point. And Searle, you can't see these chats. So, so we got the point that this is a conceptual argument. And yes, it is a conceptual argument. It's about ideas. It's about concepts. The concept of a mind is different from the concept of a string of ordered symbols. Those are just different concepts. Right? You know, and the idea that brains produce consciousness, though, in our actual universe, that's not a conceptual point. That's something we had to learn the hard way. And people thought it was the heart. People thought it was maybe the liver. I mean, people had all kinds of ideas about what exactly it is about us that makes us conscious. Turns out we have pretty good reason at this point from medical science to think, yeah, it's something to do with this structure in here. And we see very similar structures in other animals, like, chipmunks. I've looked into the eyes of a chipmunk. There's not much back there, but there's something back there. I mean, I think they can perceive, they can apparently remember. I think they can want things, they can fear things. I think chipmunks have little itty bitty chipmunk minds. And it turns out, again, this is not a conceptual point. Someone actually had to do the hard work of opening up chipmunks. You open them up, yeah, there's a little tiny itty bitty brain in there. In a lot of ways, very similar to our own, but much smaller and simpler. And what you get in the chipmunk is a creature that, to all extents and purposes, seem to have a smaller and simpler mind. Right? Did it have to be that way? No. No, we could quite easily imagine the world having turned out quite differently. But that's the way it turned out.
So are you saying that it's contingently true that water is H2O?
The acoustics in here aren't great. I'm going to try turning you up.
Right. But so are you suggesting that it is contingently true that water is H2O? That strikes me as like at least debatable.
Oh, no, I would think, and generally disagree that water is necessarily H2O. That since water, we've discovered that the stuff in our lakes and rivers has a certain chemical structure. And it had to. I mean, you can imagine a universe where the stuff in our lakes and rivers isn't H2O. But then it kind of seems like you're imagining a universe where our planet does not contain water. Right. So that, what does that have to do with consciousness and brains? Well, interesting point. If you want to identify the mind with brain stuff, well, then presumably brain stuff had to be brain stuff. That one I feel confident about. Brain stuff had to be brain stuff. Right? If it's not brain stuff, then it ain't brain stuff. I think this is very trivially true, right? Now, but it's not quite the claim, though, it's being made here. The claim isn't that we can identify, like water is H2O or heat is molecular motion. That's not quite that is a claim that you could claim, people have claimed, that consciousness is a brain activity in the same way that water is H2O. Some people have claimed that. And in that case, this is the only kind of mind there could possibly be. Right? But that seems questionable. I mean, it seems at least possible that creatures with different physical constitutions could have different minds, could have minds, maybe not too different from our own. Maybe find life on Mars, and could Martian life have a mind, even though maybe they've got a totally different chemistry from us? Well, quite possibly. So we probably don't want to just straightforward identify consciousness with something going on in our skulls. The claim's a little different. It's that consciousness in our case is caused by what's going on in our skulls. Could other things cause? Think of a fire. All kinds of ways you can start a fire. There's no one way to start a fire, but they're all fires. Different stuff will burn under different. What stuff will burn and under what conditions? Well, that one you got to find out the hard way. Can I set this thing on fire? Can I set it on fire by doing this to it? You got to try it and see what happens, right? So, but still, you could make the case that ultimately combustion is combustion. I mean, what matters is that. And then the question is, how do you bring about combustion? There's different ways to do it. And we could say perhaps something similar about consciousness. This is the answer that I personally would like to give, and I think is probably the one that makes the most sense, is that consciousness is kind of like fire. We know that this can start that fire. Could other stuff? I mean, possibly. I mean, I don't know that it wouldn't. Right? Could you put copper and silicon molecules in the right order and start the fire of consciousness? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Let's try it and find out what happens. But it's not a conceptual point. I can't conclude that if I could get it to shuffle ones and zeros around in the right order, then it would be conscious. Like, I'm not sure that makes any sense, though. I think the Chinese room is a good reason to believe that that's not true.
I guess that's something I've debated. What is the difference between consciousness and a sufficiently complex program that's eventually gotten to the point where it's created its own definition of
Yeah. Well, the difference, if this is all right, the difference would be that one is 100% syntax. I mean, no matter how complicated it gets, it's still just zeros and ones that the machine is unable to attach any meaning to. At least in virtue of shuffling around the zeros and ones.
So to what degree can you define semantics outside of the context of syntax? Like, you could say, like, we assign a meaning to the word green because we have the experience of the color green.
Yeah.
You could think of the color as just itself being another symbol, another squiggly line. And we're just making another association that when I see this, I associate it with this. And so in that sense, the meaning of the word green is just another syntactical connection.
Ah. Not quite. Right. I mean, yeah, you're right that there are some very interesting connections between syntax and semantics. But so like in the example, I like this example because it's a nice straightforward one. So I have the word green, and maybe in other languages we use a different term, or maybe we could use some kind of symbol like a hieroglyph or something to stand for green. Now, but the color that I'm using it to refer to, that's not a symbol. That's the difference between the symbol and the thing the symbol points to. That's the semantics, is reference, in this case, reference. The English word green refers to a certain location in color space. Is like that shade of what with color. It's been a while since I've been in art class. I don't remember all these technical terms about color, right? That's a hue, shade, I don't know, but color. It's referring to something. So if I say, you know, coffee cup, so that's not a symbol. I'm using a symbol to refer to that. So I saw something there.
I was saying, but if you see a picture of it,
Uh,
then you view it as a symbol.
Okay. Yeah, there is that. And of course, we often do that. I mean, if I look something up in a picture dictionary, you know, I'll get pictures and they'll say, okay, this is a coffee cup. You know, sure, I've got a kid, so there was that phase when we were looking through picture books, they have all these little photographs of things and say that's a truck. And like, you know, that's a giraffe, right? And things like that, right? So yeah, you can use the symbols, but note that what's going on there is that the photograph then is a symbol, all right. It certainly is, or the painting or whatever it is. But that is pointing to something that is not. I mean, ultimately, symbols are going to wind up pointing to something, referring to something that is not a symbol. It can't be symbols all the way down. I mean, at some point, you know, again, you're right. You can add more epicycles to this and say, I'm going to use a symbol to introduce a symbol. I can do that. I can use a symbol to introduce a symbol to introduce a symbol. I can do that too. At some point, this gets to be crazy complicated. But eventually, that chain must bottom out in that. And that's not a symbol. That's a coffee cup.
So what is the current king of France? What is the meaning of that? Is it meaningless because it lacks reference?
Yeah, that would be a definite description, and definite descriptions don't necessarily have reference. So that could still be meaningful even though it lacks a reference because it's a definite description.
Right. I'm trying to make a point with it is all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like,
So semantics can work in different kinds of ways, you know, and descriptions work a little bit differently than things like names. So,
you know, like with your coffee cup, I don't interact with the non-symbol entity itself directly, right? Like light bounces off of it, it goes to my eye, that sends some signals to my brain. That's what I'm seeing, right? In some sense, it's my brain interpreting these signals, and are the signals themselves not symbols?
we could say the symbol. It's kind of a tongue twister. We could say the signals are symbols. We could say that. The interesting thing is that the best way to describe what's happening here? So, I mean, yes, certainly there is this whole story that we get out of psychophysics about photons bouncing off a surface and propagating in the corneas and vitreous, you know, all that fun stuff I vaguely remember from my psych classes. Yeah, there's all that going on. The question is, though, what am I seeing? And is the answer, I'm seeing a visual symbol of a cup? Or is the answer, I'm seeing a cup by means of a symbol? And those are different propositions. My visual experience is allowing me to see the cup, in the sense that if I were not having the visual experience, or if you somehow broke that physical chain, like you cut my optic nerve or some horrible thing like that, then I would no longer be seeing the cup. That doesn't mean that I'm seeing the visual sense. It doesn't mean like right now I'm seeing something in my visual cortex. Seeing the cup. The cup is not in my visual cortex. This sadly empty cup. And the more I look at it, the more I'm dwelling on its emptiness, is out there on the table. Track somebody down here, because. No, I mean, so,
Symbol of coffee.
well, yeah, I had one of those butternut or butter rum coffees. Can I get a refill on that?
Yeah, totally. I can just take your.
Oh, yeah, okay. Do you need this? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can keep it if you want.
Like, we define that as a saucer. So we know that it's a saucer,
Uh-huh.
but to something else that perceives it, they may not see it as a saucer, but as a symbol of some kind of molecular form.
Well, would they, I
How
mean,
does that,
you could, I mean, we have to get clear on what exactly we're describing here, right? I mean, if the thought is, of course, as a human being who's in the business of dealing with coffee cups and saucers, yeah, I mean, I look at this thing and instantly go, yep, that's a saucer, all right. Yeah, I mean, you show this to a chipmunk, again, I've looked into the eyes of a chipmunk, there's not much back there.
it's not pretty.
Yeah, it would look at that and probably, I mean, it would not think of that at all in the same way. It's incapable of mentally representing this the way I can. And that's certainly true. But then supposing that this is true, that wouldn't mean that the chipmunk's seeing it as a symbol of something else. I don't think the chipmunk's seeing it as a symbol of anything. No, you could use this as a symbol. I mean, if we know we're in some kind of spy movie. Oh, thank you. It's very good.
Oh, good. I'm not a coffee person, but I trust your word.
All right. So if we're in a spy movie, we could say something like, this is Agent Smith's house. And you're going to be here. We could make this into a symbol. We could impose meaning on this, certainly. We need to use symbols to do that, right? Which is why language is really cool. We can do that stuff. But that doesn't mean that this,
How you perceive it.
but this thing is not itself a symbol. Presumably, again, at some point, there's something that we are pointing to with our symbols. If I've understood the point, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure I understand. AI is very complex.
But you see, it's kind of interesting, these conversations. See how many threads there are in this particular ball of yarn? Just start with anything, and all of a sudden it's like, we got into names. What are names? How do descriptions? How do descriptions work? Can you describe something that doesn't even exist? Well, sure, you can do that. The present king of France is bald. I just did. There is no president. They haven't had a monarchy for over a century. But I say, but you understood the meaning of my words, even though there is no such thing. I say, the unicorns in Narnia are really big. Well, there are no unicorns and there's no Narnia, and yet I can write stories about it. But all this stuff just all these issues are just entwined in all these ways that get crazy complicated the minute you start pulling on these threads. Which I guess in a way that's good, because it keeps me busy. And that is some good coffee. All right. Let's see. Anything else?
I just want to say, if you gave an English major the symbol, and I'm an English master's student, we can make meaning of that.
Yeah, it can be done.
Yes.
You can find ways of interpreting. Yes, you certainly can.
Which is very, advanced.
Yeah. I've seen people do this with prog rock lyrics.
Mhm.
Well, with some crazy bands, just meaningless lyrics, but he's really talking about this.
Yeah.
I don't think he was, but I guess you can read those symbols that way. Well, that's kind of like a Rorschach blot. It's just a bunch of blobs of
Yeah.
ink, but you can sort of interpret it any number of ways, and and if that's all that's going on, then you're not really wrong. It's just creativity at that point.
Mhm.
All right. What else we got? That's funny though. And by the way, that's the kind of thing where you know, I use Microsoft Word all the time, and of course, sometimes you get the little underline, it says on, and it's indicating some kind of grammatical thing, and then that happens like if I mismatch singular and plural, or I forget an apostrophe, or I stick an apostrophe where there's not supposed to be one, I get the little underline, because it can recognize, oh, you're not putting these symbols in the right order.
Mhm.
It can do that. But it would never catch colorless green ideas seriously, unless you explicitly programmed it to do that. You could say, never use the word colorless and green in juxtaposition. You could do that.
Mhm.
But then obviously you could come up with infinitely many ways of producing nonsense sentences that it would never be able to catch because it doesn't understand what they mean. Fun fact, this is kind of a true story. For a while I worked in the History of Science Society, and I was in charge of posting news postings, right? And you know, if someone was having a conference, they'd have this conference listing post on their website. And one time, when we're cutting and pasting, so sometimes the formatting goes weird. Like sometimes something will like change certain symbols to something else, right? And so then my job was to edit them, to make sure that those things got fixed before we put them up on the website. There was a conference, I know it was a conference announcement because they told me that in English, but then I got the conference announcement, it was in Bulgarian, a language with which I am entirely unfamiliar. So here's a Bulgarian conference announcement. You know, it's like, this is all just meaningless to me. But I could still go through and I could see where the cutting and pasting had caused glitches. Because all of a sudden in the middle of the word, there'd be like a question mark stuck in the middle of a word. And like, I don't speak a word of Bulgarian, but I know that ain't right. Because I know that I had the syntax. I say, I know you can't put that symbol there. It can't. Or, you know, when we do things sometimes we cut and paste things from German, and you do like the German diacritical marks, like the umlauts on the U. It would always change the U with an umlaut to a question mark. And so then I got into the habit. I see a question mark, I just delete it, stick in a U with an umlaut. Now, what does any of this German mean? I don't know. But I do know that if I see the question mark, I'm supposed to delete it and put an umlaut. I was in the German room. Or something like it, right? Shuffling around these symbols to correct them, get them in the right order, although I really had no idea what any of the symbols meant. So that, you know, you can do that. And
that goes back to the rules, right? So we can program to know the rules. We've been programming rules. And we have determined that sentence didn't make sense because we have rules that we understand, and that question mark did not belong to them. So,
but if I wanted to learn what those symbols I'm shuffling around meant, if I wanted to know that, just telling me, well, question marks can't go there, it's not going to help me. Right. No, it's true. I think you're picking up on something, which is in order for me to follow these rules, I mean, as a human editor of a website, as a human editor, I do have to consciously be aware of what the rules are. Right? But that's again a semantic point, though. I know what the rules mean. And it's interesting because in a way we've maybe been granting the computers too much. We're saying that they've been given the instructions for how to do things, you know, that they've been given rules for manipulating symbols, but they actually don't even know they've been given that.
no, and so I'm coming at this from a programmer standpoint. Like,
Okay.
if I were developing a program to understand, you see this, or these are the rules that you expect. So when you're presented this, if it doesn't fit the rules, something is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to develop some kind of formula or an algorithm to determine why this that is presented, which met this classification, does not, or this expectation does not meet the rules that it should have. And if it didn't meet these rules, this is pull it apart piece by piece and understand why it didn't match that classification.
Okay.
So to me, like, when I see this, I have a difficult time understanding what, when we're talking about, knowledge and rules and things like this, like, I have been given rules as a human about the human language through my education, which doesn't seem any different than, a program being told, these are the things that you should expect, right? So as I grow, as I learn, as I develop my own internal database, how is that any different from a computer that is taking this knowledge in, or experiences that it has, input, storing it, and then every time that it has a different input, reading its previous input and comparing it to the rules that I have given it to produce an output.
Because you know what at least some of the symbols mean.
Because I've been told.
You've been told.
And experience too, right?
Mhm.
I call this a glass because I've been told that this is a glass,
Mhm.
but I could also say it's a. Like, so, it's a glass to me, dog to somebody else, or. Oh, I know it's a glass only because I've been taught. Like, I have looked at this as a newborn baby. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I wouldn't have said. Sand, or any kind of chemical composition, and I wouldn't have said there was wine inside this glass. So, like, if a computer didn't say this is a glass, I'd be like, oh, you're an idiot. I like, if they came up with a chemical composition, or if they said this is but I wouldn't call it an idiot, is so long as it always called it.
Well, one interesting thing is that, we certainly, we are told that things are that certain words refer to certain things. And for us to be able to do that, though, in the way that we do, we have to understand one really important thing, that words can refer. That the word can stand for something else. If you don't get that, you're never going to learn new words. And that's why I kind of stress this point for a reason when I said, when I'm looking at these Chinese symbols in the Chinese room, I don't know what, if anything, they mean. I don't even know if they refer to anything. Never mind what they refer to. I don't even know whether they refer. So that's a deeper point here. And that's, this is why, by the way, I, as a speaker of a language, I can look at something like Bulgarian. To me, it's just chicken feet on the page. I mean, I have no idea what they mean. Except it's not, though. That's not exactly right. Well, I see it as unintelligible speech. It's like, I know these Bulgarian words mean something, although I don't know what. And if I really wanted to learn some Bulgarian, I could track someone down and they could walk me through some of this stuff. Because I am already capable of appreciating the fact that symbols stand for things, or they can be used to stand for things. I got that. How do I give that to something where all it ever is going to have is the symbols and never any way of saying, yes, this 0 stands for, net income. Not only does it not understand that it stands for net income, it doesn't understand, from the point of view of the guy in the Chinese room, this could all just be a crazy elaborate game of Simon Says, with no purpose whatsoever. None of these symbols mean anything. It's just, if I say this, you say that, and we'll just do this for days on end. I say this, you say that. What does any of this mean? Nothing. I'm just amused by the fact that if I say this, you say that, right? I understand the difference. And it's just giving something rules for shuffling symbols around And I just casually refer to them to symbols all this time because I know they're symbols. I know you can use zeros and ones to stand for things that aren't zeros and ones. But is telling something what order zeros and ones can go in, is that telling it that they can do that? It's hard to see how that would be, how it would. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, go for it.
I'm still having difficulty understanding. Me, I don't really see how meaning can be that divorced from association. You know, like you're saying, like these Chinese words are meaningless. And I feel like that just means that you have a bad book, right? And that like if your book came with pictures or something like that, then suddenly you would get some meaning ascribed to it.
Yeah, that's true. If you give me symbols that I do understand, I can use that as a basis for learning new meanings to symbols. Yeah, that's right.
Which means that to some degree, you know, is not the meaning itself by definition of meaning something, is that you understand the association between the symbol and the object it's supposed to be symbolizing.
I understand a very specific kind of association. Association comes in many flavors.
Okay.
Right? There's all kinds of ways things can be associated. And the association could be if you see a 1, it must be followed by a 0. That's an association. Maybe I could learn that. A different kind of association is though is this, black vertical stroke means the number 1, or it means kangaroos, or it means gross income or something like that. That's a different kind of, that is association in some sense, but it's associating meaning.
Yeah, but like, is not meaning then just like a complicated network of associations, a sufficiently complicated network of associations?
Associations of a fairly specific type, right? Which is semantic associations.
And one that would be able to adjust to another program. I mean, again, coming from the programming language, if I give it an input that it does not recognize, if it can relate it to something that it recognizes, can it adjust itself to then in the future recognize that as something that is associated with something that decided. Like, yeah.
Like here's a random example.
Okay.
Let's suppose like, I don't know, someone like wrote a video game that you started to play and you had no context whatsoever. But you found like, if you like started hitting things, sometimes you get a green light and sometimes you get a red light or something. And then you started to figure out that if you hit these things in this specific way, you would always get this response. And if you hit these things in this specific way, you'd always get this response. And over time, you enjoyed finding the patterns enough that you started to see, okay, so if I do these, I consider that like winning. And if I do these, I consider that like losing. And maybe you decide that because the winning things are harder than the losing things or something. But like, ultimately, all you did was just found these patterns, and then you started to ascribe like meaning to it because of the associations between the patterns. And there was no like objective thing that it was built on at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that I can, and maybe kind of go back to your point about the give me some crazy gibberish sentence and I can find a meaning.
Yeah.
And yeah, and certainly that's obviously the case, is that people can find meanings in things that are really not just random. I mean, actually that just explains an awful lot about human behavior, actually. The fact that things that have no meaning, but you thought that must have meant something, like it really didn't. Don't wear metal outside in a thunderstorm. That's all that means, right? So yeah, we can do that, but of course, the reason why we can do that is because we have this capacity to recognize that things might stand for other things. I mean, the idea of reference, or the idea of one thing symbolizing another. So the idea of a symbol, we have this as part of our biological makeup, is that we are capable of thinking in terms of symbols. And that means we can slap them on anything we want. And we do. And then the question is, how would you take something that doesn't already have that capacity and give it the capacity to recognize what a symbol is specifically, what it would mean for one thing to stand for something else. Start with something that doesn't have that capacity already. Give it the capacity just by telling it about the order of shapes. And say, well, how would that even go?
So like you could have, I don't know, you could have two options, like you have zeros and ones, but maybe you throw in another character
Hmm.
that you just basically give it rules, syntactical rules. It
Yeah.
says, 1 and 2 are always the same in every context whatsoever. And like,
What is always the same?
well, every syntactical rule you could possibly apply to the character 1, you also apply to the
Okay,
character
so
2.
yeah, they're syntactically equivalent.
Right. And could not, like, could sort of figure out that, okay, so 1 just means 2, or 2 just means 1.
Well, does it know that 1 means 2, or does it mean that if you see 1, let's say the rule is if you see a 1, erase it and print a 0. Well, then, of course, if 2 is treated exactly the same, then the rule would be if you see a 2, erase it and print a 0. Does that mean that 1 means 2?
Sure.
Does it? I mean, because there's other relationships we could have there.
I think like in a calculator, you have all the numbers. It's not really doing the math. It's just, it doesn't even know what it's doing. It's just spitting out what it's programmed to do. That's kind of how I see it is. You have all these characters and all these formulas in the calculator, and it's just doing it because that's how it's programmed to do.
Yeah.
But it doesn't know that it divided this long number for you and just got it done.
Yeah.
So
It all comes down to the idea, and if we got a programmer here, maybe you can correct me if I'm getting some of this wrong. But I mean, still, we're coming back to the idea of a Turing machine, which I briefly mentioned, I think, on the handout there. A Turing machine is this hypothetical machine. It's an imaginary machine, but we build things that are they sort of behave like them under temporary contexts. But the idea of a Turing machine is you got a tape, and he was originally imagining a tape that was infinitely long. And right there, you realize this is why you can't build one. You're never going to find an infinitely long tape. Anything you could build is going to have a limited memory store. Yeah, and it's going to have a memory store. But the tape is divided into squares, and the rules are that you got a reader head, which looks at one square at a time, and then it's got a set of instructions for what to do depending on what's in front of it and what it's already done, right? And so it's a very simple set of operations. Move the square 1 to the left, move the tape 1 square to the left, move the tape 1 square to the right, print erase a 0, print a 1, erase a 1, print a 0, or halt, just stop. These are it. I mean, as I recall, that's from reading Turing's work. That's a Turing machine. That sucker can run any computer program. And the thing is, give me a roll of toilet paper. Give me 2 pebbles. I can implement a Turing machine. I got the toilet papers divided into squares. I can spool it 1 square to the left. I can spool it 1 square to the right. I can put down a pebble. I can pick up a pebble. I could stop. I can implement any program. Very, very slowly. You'd not want me to actually do this. This is merely, it could be done. That's not to say that anybody would ever want to see this happen. I know I wouldn't. But give me a roll of toilet paper and 2 pebbles and the encode book, and I could run any conceivable program. The question is that going to tell me anything about what symbols mean? I mean, I already went into the situation understanding what symbols meant. That's what I say. Could a computer think? Yeah. Because when Turing was talking about computers back in the 30s, he meant women mathematicians with like pencils with erasers on the other end and scratch paper. When he used the word computer back in the 30s, that's what he was referring to. Was female, human. Most of them were women at this point for some reason. There's probably some interesting sociological story there. But he was talking about human mathematicians with scratch paper and pencils with erasers on the end. That's what he meant when he talked about computers. Could computers think? Yes, it's terribly insulting to suggest that they could not. Right. But they're not thinking because they're shuffling pieces of scratch paper around and erasing zeros and printing ones. That's not why they're thinking. That's not what explains their ability to think. What explains their ability to think is that they understand the idea of a symbol and they know how to apply symbols to things. And that's something that's really got nothing to do with if you see a zero, erase it and write a one instead. So this way, it depends what exactly the question is, right? I mean, you know, could a computer think? Yes, of course it could. Give me the toilet paper and the pebbles, and I will be thinking the whole time I'm doing this. I'm thinking, why did you make me do this, right? But I think, and I can run programs, but I'm not thinking because I'm running a program. It's not clear that that makes sense. Thinking is semantic. Programs by definition aren't.
So I can think to think, but I can't think to understand.
Well, if thinking involves, by definition, some level of understanding, I think it would have to have at least some.
Maybe not understand, comprehend.
Okay.
So like you can't comprehend what it's doing because you can't understand like the full grasp of what's happening. But it can think to do the process that we told it to do. So it's kind of like Pavlov in a way. Whereas like we ring the bell, it salivates. It doesn't really understand quite why it salivates, but it just salivates either way, whether a bell's ring or not.
Okay. Yeah, and so there's a completely automatic kind of, you know, stimulus response sort of thing going on with the case of Pavlov and the dogs, which by the way also explains a startling amount of human behavior. Really, it's quite remarkable. People talk about Pavlovian conditioning like it's some little minor curiosity in psychology. Like, no, this actually explains a startling amount of human life. But it's But that's an interesting thing. I mean, as you know, if you gave me the instructions in the code book, I would understand that I had been given instructions. You know, and I would understand that these pebbles and squares of toilet paper might stand for something else. Although I might not be able to figure out what, but I would know that they did. So yeah, and that's something I brought to the game. I mean, that's something I didn't just suddenly get that when they gave me the code book. I had that well before they gave me the code book. If that makes sense. At some point, I lose track of what makes sense and what doesn't.
AI is very good. Figuring out what's the difference between intelligence and intelligence. It's very complex.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if it's artificial intelligence, oh yeah, I'm sorry, go for it.
Because a lot of what you were saying, I almost understood it as recognition. Like I understood, I recognize something, so I know that this is my response. But that's a form of understanding, but it's not also full understanding. That makes sense.
I mean, there is such a thing as partial understanding, but note that even partial understanding is kind of, you know, understanding to a degree, but that degree is still greater than zero.
Yeah.
Right. And if we're imagining this thing rolling off the box at Microsoft, and its degree of understanding at this point is literally zero. It understands nothing about anything. Now, your job is to give it understanding, at least a little bit. Like, what are you even asking me to do to the thing? I mean, I can tell it to erase zeros and print ones instead. I can tell it to do that, but how do I get it to understand that these are symbols that could stand for things other than themselves? That, you know, that's the essence of semantics, is that these things, you know, can symbolize, that they represent things.
Couldn't you make the same argument for people though? Like at some point, you're just a fertilized egg and then understanding blossoms out of that somehow.
I guess I take that back to like constant learning. Like, would you say that AI can or cannot? Because I see that like when the children, at some point you know nothing, but eventually you learn and you learn to infer things. You know, and some people are always better at than others. Like I would say my fiance, who like she knows can definitely infer from reading more than I can ever. Like he could read this sentence, the color screen ideas sleep ferociously. He'll probably tell you a lot that I could never even like think about. And I think, wow, these people are more creative than I am. And sometimes I think this AI is more creative than I am, but.
Does that become intelligence? Does that define intelligence?
But the ability to learn and adapt and improve your answer based on when you learn new things is intelligence in my mind.
General intelligence is full comprehension, like,
It's full comprehension.
but like, I can be intelligent and have like the desire to want to learn more. In the understanding of comprehending what I'm learning. When you get to the point, it's like 2 + 2. I can always know 2 + 2 = 4, but if I don't understand or comprehend that 2, it's 2 separate things together, plus 2 separate things together make 4, that's just symbols on paper. And I can always give you 4 because I can read and memorize 2 + 2 always equals 4. But I'll never understand that if I can't like comprehend and gain intelligence and breaking that apart in my head.
You comprehend that two is
Yeah.
multiple contexts. This is not just two allies.
With anything.
Yes, I mean, so it's a mathematical concept and you understand that that little curlicue thing stands that. Right. And maybe in a different numerical system, like if you're using the Roman system, it'd be two little vertical tallies. That stands for the same concept. So they have the same meaning. Right. And then how
Well, but this is an interesting point, right? Because if that has a meaning, the number 2 has a meaning associated to it, then what is the object of that meaning? What is the 2?
that would
Because
be, yeah.
it's like 2, if you think about it, it's a concept that just represents a pattern. I have 2 of these things, 2 apples, 2 oranges, 2 bears, whatever. Like, it's not an actual thing in and of itself. It's rather a way that we describe pairs of things. And in that sense, it doesn't actually have any, I would say, meaning outside of it being symbolic.
Well, let's see. It stands for the numeral. Right, a little squiggle, little curlicue thing. The numeral stands for a certain concept.
Okay.
Right. Now, what exactly we want to say about that thing? Well, here we're getting the philosophy of mathematics, right? There are Platonists out there who are going to say, no, the number 2 is this thing that's as real as you or I. Others don't go that far. They want to say something. There's many different ways of spelling this out. But the thought is, what you're not thinking about is just this curlicue squiggle thing. Although maybe if you were a computer, that's all you could think about is just that little squiggle thing, right? But what you can do, for example, is recognize that there's multiple different ways of representing the same idea. There are little curlicue thing, or the Roman, the 2 vertical tallies. The Chinese, it's 2 horizontal tallies, but it's they're all the same. However exactly we want to cash out what that concept is, that's the meaning that these different numerals are all encoding.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is that the meaning is the association.
It's the association of the symbol with a meaning.
No, not necessarily between the symbols, like what the number 2 means. It's associating, look, here I have 2 apples, here I have 2 oranges, here I have 2 bears, here I have 2 sharks. I'm saying there's a concept here.
Yeah.
Which is at play. What is that concept? I define it by how these things are all associating.
Okay.
And so if it has a meaning, the meaning rises out of this syntactical association.
I guess the concept of learning, how's it separate from AI? Like, we learn by taking in new information, comprehending it, and turning something else. How's it different than AI? They take in information, build off on it, and then make connections based on all those connections, spreading out.
Well, there's connections and there's connections, right? I mean, the connections come in many flavors. Associations come in many flavors. I mean, the association could just be juxtaposition. If you see this one, stick one of these next to it. That's an association. That doesn't tell you what, if anything, these mean. What we're talking about here is something that we can do, which is that it's a very specific kind of association, meaning. So we associate a symbol the meaning. Or, it's an association, but it's a semantic association. So it's not just juxtaposition, for example, like if I say green, you yell banana, right? I mean, that's a kind of association, but it doesn't tell us anything about what either of those words mean, if they mean anything.
Yeah, but like, so I'm actually a mathematician.
Oh, okay, all right.
At Fort Hayes, and like the way that mathematicians formally define the number two, right? The way that it's formally defined is you say,
Yeah, I know, I want to hear this.
Yeah. if you just start from scratch and you just say, like, what is two? Since you don't want to start with the symbol, you literally say, okay, you could imagine that first I can come up with something where I have a pair of things, where I have two distinct things.
Mhm.
And then you could imagine that I could come up with another group of things, and I could come up with a way to associate them, where I associate one thing here with one thing there and one thing here with one thing there. And if I can do that in a way that's sort of one-to-one, everything here gets mapped to everything here, then I say that's the same number of things.
Mhm.
And then in that sense, all I have to do is I have to say, okay, so, two is just basically, it's a class. It's a class
Yeah,
of all of
okay.
these different things.
It's a
And
class
that's
of
what I
all pairs,
associate with, and that's what I associate with the number two.
Mhm.
And so what I'm saying is that, like, literally that association of just saying, I'm associating, and this is what the association is. It's not juxtaposition, it's one-to-one mappings. That association rises out the concept two. And then the concept two is now a semantic concept, right?
Let's see,
You're at the sign. Like, you've seen these associations and you can sort of, this is two. Right, like you, and through education, many people have decided, yes, I agree with you, this is two.
Mhm.
And so we educate other people, this is two.
Yeah.
And they extrapolate from there to say, okay, so if this is two, then this is probably two as well. So to me, that's a program. That is something that's written down and programmed into us to decide, yes, through all of these associations, through these relations, we've decided this is two. And therefore, this is similar enough, so we're gonna say this is two as well. And so when you take these things and you have another group of things that are similar, and you add them together, you get.
okay. So I think there's a few different things going on here. One has to be, one thing that we have to watch out is to distinguish between the context in which we would learn a symbol and the meaning of the symbol. Those are actually different ideas. Because I mean, we have to be able to abstract away from the specific context in which we were taught a sign and being able to use it outside of that context. So it's a question of how I would learn something versus what it is that I learn. I mean, and there is a difference between how I learn something and what it is that I learned. Because otherwise I'd say, well, what did I learn in school? I learned everything my teacher taught me. Like, what do you mean you learned everything your teacher taught me? I mean, I learned that, Mrs. Johnson said a whole bunch of stuff. It's like, yeah, well, then you didn't learn a damn thing. Right? You got to understand that, yeah, yes, that was well, I've heard people say with a straight face, like, how do you know that 2 + 2 = 4? Like, well, because my kindergarten teacher told me that. Like, that is not how you know that. I mean, yeah, although you're right, that was the person who drew your attention to that fact. Yes. And maybe you wouldn't have learned it otherwise, although I would think that's pretty distressing if that's true. But that doesn't mean that's why you believe. It's like she drew your attention to this idea, but then you sort of took it from there, right? You got a concept you're able to, so that's one interesting thing to think about. I mean, is that the difference between what it takes to learn something versus what exactly it was that you learned. Because like I could teach kids about, I've seen this again. I had a young son, and there was a time when we learned about all these animals by looking at pictures in books. If he's actually going through life thinking that zebras are just creatures in books, then something has failed. He's like, no, the zebra isn't that. The zebra is one of those critters out there that you saw a picture of one. That was the context in which you learned it. But what you learned is not simply that there is that funny looking white and black stripy critter on that page. It's like that's a picture of something else, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind.
So what if your son was, blind, deaf, leprosy, couldn't feel, couldn't smell, couldn't taste, had no sensory experience whatsoever? He was just sort of like,
Yeah.
just laying there. And
Okay.
you managed to somehow you feed some information to him by maybe sending electrical impulses to his brain or something. And in an effort to communicate with your son, you're trying to communicate, these pictures of zebras and everything. Where exactly does the semantics versus the syntax come in there, right? Because he'll never be able to experience a zebra.
That would depend, I suppose, partly on the exact nature of the experience that we're causing him to have. But the syntax in a case like that, at least the way I'm kind of picturing what you described, I don't think there'd be syntax at all. Just if I just stimulate his visual cortex in the right way, he'll have a vision of a zebra. And it's like, I'm not sure that's anything about the ordering of symbols. It's just that, and maybe he would get that he's getting a mental picture of some real creature outside his mind. Maybe he'd get that, and maybe he wouldn't. It's hard to say. But I don't think that's syntactic at all. It just seems like that's if there's no question of what order the symbols go.
But what you're doing is you're figuring out how the hardware works. You're figuring out what the hardware needs to read, and you're figuring out what's the right input I need to give the hardware so that it creates the thing I want it to do. Is that not
you don't have to continue to reference that, I think, like you as a mathematician now, you don't have to continually reference this initial input that you got on what the number 2 is to understand 2. You've turned that into an abstraction that you understand on a higher level, I think that's the difference between a computer, obviously. They continually have to reference the information that they've been fed.
So, yeah. Okay. Good. Let's see. Oh yeah. So I'm just gonna. I'm not sure that what that's describing is syntax exactly. There's no suggestion like this is a symbol that you can put in order with other symbols. I just don't think. Again, partly is going to depend on exactly what is going on in this kid's consciousness, which is a little bit hard to figure out. Right?
So I mean, so what if you had an AI that its input wasn't necessarily feeding it zeros and ones, but you had I don't know, a camera hooked up or something, and its input was just in sort of a similar fashion where it's hard to say that it's syntax that you're feeding.
All right.
Just
that's a good point. Now let's think about this. Suppose I got one of these old school, desktop computers, doesn't have a camera. I thought,
those.
Yeah. So guys, I want my desktop computer to have a camera. So I get a camera and I get a Black & Decker power drill, and I drill a hole in that sucker and stick the camera in there. Does it work?
I mean, maybe.
Of course not.
Depends on if the camera's dependent on the desktop or not.
I mean, I just drilled a hole in I just drilled a hole in the hull and stuck a wire in,
Okay.
and that's literally all I did. They're like, no, it's got to be hooked up in the right way. Okay. But what is the right way? I mean, how do you get a computer to take photon energy there is an answer. You've got to translate the photon energy into zeros and ones, otherwise the program won't know what to do with it.
Yellow wire where the red one's supposed
I guess in my mind, I think of this as I think no matter how much I learn to study certain this, I don't think I'd ever be able to fully comprehend it. And I feel like in these situations, an AI would be able to comprehend so than I would.
Well, the thing is, the computers are only ever going to speak zeros and ones. Which is zeros and ones and stuff you can do with zeros and ones. And there's only a couple things you can do with zeros and ones. That means, well, what if I want to give it visual input? You can do that if you can figure out a way to electronically transform phosphorescent dots into zeros and ones. And it turns out, yeah, you can do that, which is how this stuff works. And that's amazing. Someone spent a lot more time on that than I'd ever be willing to do. And someone who's, and yeah, how they do this, I mean, it seems almost magic, but that is what eventually they're doing. Because again, it's got to be something I could run with a toilet paper and two pebbles. It has
But
to.
isn't that the same with organics? Like, you can't stick a glass up there and say, "Hey, I understand the nature of the universe." Right?
Yeah.
So, like, there has to be some kind of interface for my eyeballs and my brain.
Yeah, there's got to be something. I mean, you can't, the certain biological equipment has to work properly.
But that to me is the same thing. Yeah, that is the form of intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? That's working together.
Well, for the computer, though, the thing is, it's enough to turn it into zeros and ones. We're done, as long as it's got instructions for what to do with the zeros and ones. And that's just basic computing stuff, right? But I'm gonna need more than the zeros and ones. I mean, yeah, it's true. You got to somehow find a way to feed me the information. If I've had severed optic nerves or something, you got to find something else to do to get it back to my visual cortex. But what I'm getting is not, even if you could somehow just give me the zeros and ones, that wouldn't be enough. I need meanings. I need to be able to know what the zeros and ones stand for. The computer doesn't know and doesn't care. For the purpose of running a program, it's totally irrelevant whether the zeros and ones stand for anything at all. For an organic creature like me, it does. That's actually the crucial thing, is what do these electrical impulses stand for? What do they represent? I need that. Not just what order they come in, but what do they mean? What do they represent? What are they symbolizing? So although there may be some commonality here, like, yeah, we can't just magically transfer information. It doesn't work that way, whether we're talking about laptops or whether we're talking about, human perception. You got to somehow transmit information through some recognizable physical channels. Sure. Question is, what exactly is the nature of the information that you're getting, and what are you capable of doing with it? And if the thought is, well, you give me a bunch of shapes, I can shuffle the shapes around. Right? That's a program. Versus you give me the shapes, I can tell you that the shapes mean something. And maybe they mean a zebra. And that's something quite different.
So, okay. So if we take, then let's break down maybe the biological hardware into other examples. So you gave an example of a chipmunk, but there are far less complex things out there, right? Like we could look at a tapeworm or something,
Yeah.
and you could see that it has a rough approximation of something resembling a brain that sort of drives its decision makings or everything. Or if you want to go really far down the chain, you could talk about like a sea sponge.
Yeah.
Where they don't even really have a brain or something. They just directly take pressure input of water, and then they sort of adjust the sizes of pores accordingly to try to filter out food and that sort of thing. What degrees can those be considered consciousness or a mind, even if it's not directly, it's not feeding zeros and ones. It's sort of taking input information the same way we do.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. And as you go far enough down the phylogenetic scale, yeah, I mean, eventually you get to things like, I'm sure this is conscious, that's going to be conscious, but probably has less of a sophisticated mind than we do. You get down to the level of, chipmunks, like that's a very primitive mind, but I think it's got one. Not a real high quality one, but it's got one. And they get down to something where, I mean, I don't know what to say. Does a clam have a mind? I mean, is a clam conscious? Could a clam understand anything? I don't know. You get down to something like an earthworm. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that earthworms are just nothing but bundles of reflexes. Actually, I've seen good evidence to suggest that frogs are nothing but bundles of reflexes. Frogs may not be conscious, right? Yeah, but certainly get down to something like a starfish, this very alien life form, or like a tapeworm, where it's, I don't know, it's a few neurons. I mean, it seems like it's all just reflexes. I mean, at some point, it looks like you're crossing some kind of line where, like, yeah, I'm positive that's got a mind. Yes, I'm positive I'm not so sure about that one. And finally, get something like a fern, like, and I'm positive the fern does not have a mind, right? I'm pretty sure that sponges don't. But then there's a question of the epistemology. I mean, how would you know? How do you know whether or not this thing has a mind?
Maybe chipmunks are geniuses and
Yeah.
just can't interpret it correctly.
Maybe they just really, really like. Maybe they just really like being eaten.
Yeah.
We get down to and but there's an epistemic question here. It's like, well, how do I know about this creature's consciousness? And at some point, it may be very difficult to say.
Yeah.
That would be a question where, there's some fact that we may not know. There's some fact about this creature that we don't know, and that maybe we can't know.
Yeah. I was thinking of, so like we have a dog and he cocks his head, and every time he does that and people see it, they're like, wow, that's a sign of intelligence. And I'm like, well, I kind of looked into it, and it's something about hearing or whatever, and not intelligence, but people view it as that is intelligence. But like how they can't know, they don't know that because it's not true, first of all. But,
Criterion 1.
Yes.
Is it true?
Yeah, it's like along the same lines of, you can't really know how do you know, like, what you are perceiving is to be intelligence is actually intelligence, or vice versa, like something that's not, you think, okay, that's obviously not intelligent because it doesn't do X, Y, and Z. The thing is you'll never know, or at least this what we have.
Yeah, I mean, on the basis of the information that we have, I mean, I don't even know if clams are conscious at all.
Mhm.
And if they are, I mean, or earthworms, are earthworms conscious at all? I mean, or if they are, what is their consciousness like? I gotta think it's just like dirt, right? I mean, I think that's the total consciousness of an earthworm, I would think. But that's an epistemic question. It's not a conceptual one. I mean, epistemic questions are conceptual, but this example is what can I know about this creature on the basis of observing its anatomy, on the basis of observing its behavior? And that's a little different than the question is, well, what would this be would running a program be conceptually enough to understand something? That's a conceptual question. What are the concepts involved in that idea? And it's like, well, it involves two very different concepts. One is about syntax, one's about semantics. Now, what kinds of creatures are capable of having, experiences with contents? I mean, I know I can. Dogs, sure. Chipmunks, sure. Spiders, probably. Earthworms, I don't know. Amoebas, no. I'm going to draw the line. I'm going to draw the line at single-celled organisms. Right? But notice that there are those two different questions, which is how would you know whether this creature's consciousness versus what would it mean for this thing to be conscious? Those are quite different. Like, what are you asking exactly? Again, sorting out. A lot of the time sorting out the questions is half the battle. Like, sometimes sorting out the questions is about 3/4 of the battle, right? I'm just sort it out like, look, these are different questions. Answering this one is fairly easy. Answering this one is pretty hard, but at least we know these are different questions. The question is, is an earthworm conscious? That's a hard one. A little tricky to say. Is an earthworm conscious because it knows how to manipulate symbols without understanding their contents? No. It doesn't make any sense. this is kind of, again, see, all, I said this earlier, there's a lot of threads in this ball of yarn.
Yeah.
right? We're getting here the idea of different forms of consciousness. Bats. Let's see, no, I'll use my own example here. The platypus. Seen these critters, right? They look like, I mean, what are they? I mean, these crazy looking animals. They're like some kind of weird grab bag animals with they got like duck beaks and like webbed feet and a big beaver tail and they're just insane looking creatures. Like they got to be designed by a committee, right? But the platypus beak, this crazy looking beak that this animal has, that's a sophisticated sensory organ. The platypus can stick its beak in the water and it can sense the location and movement of fish in the water by means of detecting their bioelectrical fields. That's what that beak can do. It's got little sensors on it that sense weak electrical currents in the water. It can stick its face in the water and tell where all the fish are and where they're going and how fast they're going. Pretty remarkable. My question for you is, what's it like to do that? What's it like to do that? What's it like to stick your face in the pond, like I can feel where all the fish are by their electrical fields?
Makes me wish I could do this.
Doesn't it though? Like I really like what it would be like to be a platypus. But what is it like to be a platypus? 2 points about this. One, you understand the question, don't you? You know exactly what I'm asking you. And it's pretty damn hard to see how you're going to figure out what the answer is. Because you're not a platypus. I mean, I could maybe attach little electrical sensors to your face and wire them to your, motor cortex or something, and you could do something. But of course, you still would not be having the experience that a normal platypus would. Because if you did it, you'd be thinking, man, this is awesome. And I assure you, the platypus is not thinking that.
There's a supervillain sonar face.
Sonar, yeah. Yes, he has the mildly impressive ability to sense the presence of fish in the water by sticking his face in it. Right, which is kind of a neat party trick, but that's about it. But that's a thought. The example that was kind of famous back in 1974. There was Thomas Nagel wrote, bats, they can fly around and they emit ultrasonic squeaks, and they can tell where the bugs in the air are by echolocation. It's like, what's it like to be a bat? Seems like there's got to be there must be an answer to that question, and yet we don't know what it is. And it might kind of bother us, but it seems like we could not know the answer to that question unless I actually, unless I could somehow turn myself into a bat. But again, if I really just became a bat, well, then I wouldn't be able to think about the question at all because I'm a bat, right? So the facts about consciousness, like, is there something that it's like to be a clam? I don't know. And if there is, I have no idea what it could possibly be. I mean, I guess I could imagine sitting on the bottom of the seabed and like, all right, well, I'm just sitting on the bottom of the seabed for my whole life now. I mean, I could maybe imagine that, but that's not what a clam is experiencing. They're experiencing something, again, if they are experiencing anything at all, which I'm not entirely convinced of. They might just be nothing but reflexes. I have no way of knowing what this is. And if there is some connection, and I would argue that there is, I seem to recall having once written a dissertation to this effect. There is this connection between meaningful mental contents and consciousness in this way. If there is that connection, like I at one point argued in print that there was, so I'm stuck with it now, then yeah, that really is what the question comes down to: is there something that's like to be this machine? And if there's not, if it's just a box of switches, and they're unconscious switches, then the idea of this thing having any meaningful content is, there's content, all right, but the content is us, it's the users. We impose content on it. It has no content of its own. mean, supposedly we got this room until 8, but I don't know. It's a good conversation, though. It's really nice. This is. I didn't say this is my first one. I've never attended anybody else's, but so I don't know how they went, but I heard they went well. So yeah, this is good, I think. And this is, I believe this is ever the first time we've ever tried the virtual attendance.
I know this is the thing, I saw an email.
How often does it happen?
Oh, I think they try to schedule one a month.
Oh,
I mean, I think that was the plan. What do you think? We've run this one into the ground, or actually, no, we haven't, but maybe we've run
Yeah.
ourselves into the ground. at
Yeah.
this point. I think that's maybe more accurate. I want to point out, I teach a class in philosophy of mind. I'll just throw that one out there, just in case you want more of this. Yeah. Good. Anything else? That sounds like we're good, yeah. All right. Well, that's all I had. I think we can, I think we've reached a natural stopping point, I think, here. So I think just call it quits. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Thank you for all the virtual people. Hey,
Thank you.
being here in not exactly in the flesh, but in the pixels. So thank you, everybody. I had a good time. Hope you did too.